So I clicked on this video and Tim Pool threatened to give an overview of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Tim Pool has the worst talking points of all time on this conflict, but he does have creative talking points, which makes him interesting to listen to, which is why I thought this would make for a great video where I could kind of go over the history of the conflict from my own point of view and contrast that to Tim Pool and show you where he's wrong. So let's get into it.
What's the Qatar-Turkey pipeline? My favorite launching point.
I don't know.
So in 2012, The Guardian reported that the U.S. had been working on a project.
It's just an oil pipeline. Oil pipeline that would essentially go through Syria, Qatar, Turkey, and give the EU alternative oil to Russia. Because they don't like buying Russian oil for some reason. That's something that the Biden and Trump administrations all had in common. They didn't like the fact that the EU had to buy oil from Russia. So in the late 2000s, they were like, let's build this alternative pipeline. And it went completely nowhere because Assad was like, why the heck would I build that through Syria? And then once the civil war started, of course, it went out the window.
To build a natural gas pipeline from Qatar through Syria, Turkey, into Europe to offset the Russian Gazprom gas monopoly. Russia controls about a quarter of natural gas into Europe through Ukraine, which leads to high gas prices in Europe. They've tried offsetting this in numerous ways, but Russia basically controls it. So the U.S. went to Syria, the Assad regime, and said, we're going to build this pipeline. It's going to provide Europe with cheaper energy, and it's going to lower the cost across the board. Syria then conferred with Russia, their ally, who has a military base in Tartus. And Syria came back to the U.S. and said, we're not going to let you do it because it would be damaging to the economics of Russia.
Sure.
So the U.S.
Also, Assad has no incentive to do that. Why the heck would he help out the people that he hates, the Westerners like America, EU, the Israel? Why would he help out those people? He has no incentive to do that unless he's given something that he can't turn down. But he wasn't. It's against his interests, and it would piss all of his allies off. So, of course, he did that.
Was upset, obviously, but it got really bad when Russia, Syria, and Iran plotted to then build a rival pipeline from the exact same oil field through Iraq into Syria, Turkey, into Europe to strengthen their monopoly on energy. The U.S. got pissed. It's around this time that they said the Bashar al-Assad regime needs to go in their terrorists, and that's when we got...
the Tim Poolism of connecting points that should not be connected. So... what he's stipulating is that because this oil pipeline that will go through Iran and Iraq and Syria was being plotted, the U.S. would essentially intervene and destroy the Assad regime and implement another regime that would implement something like the Qatar-Turkey pipeline. That's obviously complete insanity. Chronologically, it's just wrong. The CIA operation to fund the Free Syrian Army and other rebel groups happened after the Civil War started, after Gaddafi was mass imprisoning people, firing into protesters, killing thousands, torturing people. So the idea that we wanted to topple Assad not because he was committing mass human rights abuses, but because he was preventing us from decreasing Russian influence in the European Union by a negligible amount is just a very weak argument. It's incredibly weak, but you can see how people can be stumped by it.
Operation Timber, what was that one? Let me pull this one up. See, it's like,
the CIA, Timber Syracuse? Sycamore? It was like the name of a tree or something.
Timber Sycamore. Operation Timber Sycamore is when the U.S. started providing weapons and CIA training to various revolutionary, let me just pull it up, factions.
This is a Free Syrian Army, mostly, from my research. It was Free Syrian Army and other rebel groups. It ended up having an adverse effect when us funneling all of those weapons into Syria ended up on the black market, and ISIS and Al-Qaeda could then take advantage of that. That is often twisted to us directly funding ISIS and Al-Qaeda by people like Dave Smith. But yeah, I think it was a good intention CIA operation. I think Assad had to go, but that's a different debate.
In Syria, ultimately, which ended up joining al-Nusra and ISIS. And that's how we ended up seeing U.S. weapons and training in the hands of ISIS expanding in the region, because the U.S. wanted to topple the Assad regime so we can build a pipeline. So, where are we today? Well, the U.S. has...
So you see how he's making these connections and then referring to them as if they're a fact. There's zero evidence that Timber Sycamore was to build an oil pipeline. Zero. It's just not true. Also, yes, the Syrian rebels that we funded were ideologically very diverse, which means, yes, some of them were Islamists, not jihadists, I believe. They were all vetted, but we weren't perfect. Free Syrian Army was not a perfect ideological group to take over and rule Syria. It was simply a mechanism of overthrowing Assad. We did donate to groups that were anti-Assad, but we might not have done enough to make sure that they weren't supporting other interests. We were too focused on toppling Assad, and in my opinion, we should have taken more direct pathways to toppling Assad.
Other means of trying to get the prices down and control natural gas in Ukraine. That is through Burisma, an energy company in Ukraine for which the founder was a man named Mykola Zlochevsky. Mm-hmm. The U.S. had a former CIA director of terrorism on the board, as well as the son of the sitting vice president, Hunter Biden, which seemed to make no sense, except when you realize it was a U.S.-aligned foreign influence operation to control the government of Ukraine, to put pressure on the land leases.
All right, this is like microchips and vaccines type stuff. It's so wild. So, according to Tim Pool, the U.S. coordinated the former CIA official who was working on the board of Burisma and Hunter Biden to be there specifically to advocate for Western oil interests. Please give me hard evidence of this. That would be a massive breach of public trust if that was actually the case. Possibly illegal. It's not the typical path that I see conservatives take with Hunter Biden, but in some ways it's worse. It's completely conspiratorial.
For which they could cause problems for Gazprom, which is Russia's ability to supply energy to Europe. So then we get the Burisma scandal. Viktor Shokin, the prosecutor in Ukraine, was currently...
Again, there was the idea that the pipelines going through Ukraine were ever going to be sabotaged by Ukraine internally is stupid. The only issues that we had with Russia's pipelines is when they tried to bypass Ukraine. It's just that simple. We had no issue with them going through Ukraine.
Investigating Mykola Zlochevsky, the founder of Burisma, for corruption. Joe Biden got an email. He got contact.
I mean, that's just not true. The Viktor Shokin was absolutely not investigating Zlochevsky. The UK, which froze the assets of Burisma and Zlochevsky, essentially considered it over when Shokin wouldn't give them the evidence that they requested. They considered the case closed based on lack of evidence. Also, Shokin's deputy basically said the case was shelved. He said it was dormant. More examples. The ACAC, Ukrainian watchdog over corruption, said that Viktor Shokin and the previous two prosecutor generals were all sabotaging the investigation into Burisma. U.S. ambassador to Ukraine corroborated that by accusing Shokin of not complying with the UK's demands. So accusing him of sabotaging the deal as well. So it's not only Joe Biden who wanted Shokin out. Again, people hated Shokin. The IMF hated Shokin. Transparency International specifically singled him out as someone who should be fired. This is not Joe Biden's ordeal. Multiple Republicans in the United States Senate, Ron Johnson, Mark Kirk signed a letter saying Ukraine has to reform the office of Prosecutor General. That's what happened.
By Devin Archer and Hunter Biden over their involvement in Burisma and the fact they're being investigated by a state prosecutor. Viktor Shokin signed a sworn affidavit that the only reason he was terminated was because Biden personally flew in and threatened to illegally withhold congressionally approved loan guarantees unless he was fired, and it had to do with Hunter Biden being on the board, who was getting $83,000 a month potentially.
Yeah, that's complete BS. No. He was terminated because of Joe Biden's actions. Joe Biden's actions were not illegal. They were perfectly legal. Congress did not appropriate those funds. They said Ukraine is essentially viable to get these loan guarantees, the $1 billion of loan guarantees, at the discretion of the executive branch. So whenever Obama wants to implement those, he can. And Joe Biden was doing his job by making sure that Ukraine wasn't corrupt, as he should have. So that's just another BS talking point. It's yeah, I mean, I don't even know what to say.
More. He was then fired from his position. Now, the fascinating thing is Mykola Zlochevsky, while he was under investigation for corruption, fled Ukraine. I believe he went to Monaco. At this time is around when Devon Archer, Hunter Biden are making contact with the State Department saying, we need help on this. Within a few days, Joe Biden flies out completely illegally, tells the president of Ukraine, fire your state prosecutor or you're not getting the money. To which this person replied, I believe it was Poroshenko, you don't have the authority to do that. You can't do that. And he says, call the president, see what he says. Son of a bitch.
Yeah, guess what? Devon Archer also testified, and he said that Shokin was good for Zlochevsky. He said he was good for Zlochevsky because he was not investigating him. He was slow-walking the investigation. That's why the public hated Shokin. He said, I mean, it's not a hard thing to understand. Shokin was absolutely not investigating Zlochevsky. He was not investigating Burisma. That's the only thing you have to know.
He got fired. And they put in someone good, is the quote that Joe Biden said. However, this guy they put in drops the investigation into Zlochevsky, whose funds were frozen by London under corruption investigations, who then immediately returned to Ukraine. So,
All right. This is how you know Tim Pool is just full of complete, utter BS. The UK unfroze the assets far before the Zlochevsky case was dropped. Because they had determined that Shokin wasn't even investigating him in good faith, and if he was, there was a lack of evidence. So they said, case closed, no evidence. Guess what? Shokin did the same thing. His deputy said so. ACAC said so. The ambassador to Ukraine said so. They all said he was either not investigating Ukraine or actively sabotaging the investigation, because there was no evidence.
This whole period, they're saying none of it's happening. It's never happening. And in fact, once the investigations were dropped because of Joe Biden's involvement, the guy who was accused of corruption returned back to his operations in this country. Where we currently are is following the failures of Western soft power to secure.
And he did take a plea deal in 2023 admitting to corruption. I don't know the specifics of that case, but he bribed an official to drop investigations against him. I don't know if it was those investigations or different investigations, but the Ukraine did not welcome him with open arms and say, you're free of everything. No, he had to pay for what he did.
Fewer in this energy conflict, of which there's a bit more. Russia wanted to build a trade federation, and they had a free trade agreement with Ukraine. Ukraine was also being offered up Schengen zone access and EU access if they chose to go with NATO and the West instead. A large portion of Ukraine split largely on the east to west, the Donbass, largely leaning towards Russia, wanted to join the EU because it would give access to Ukrainian citizens to Europe. And what did we see with Poland? When they entered the Schengen zone, Polish people immediately started moving to the UK and to other countries where they can get higher standards of living. Same thing happened with Greece, which caused economic instability. So the West told Ukraine, we're not going to let you into the EU unless you reach a certain standard. So you end up getting Victoria Nuland. She flies down. She's heavily engaged in the politics of Ukraine, trying to convince people to be in Ukraine to support Western expansion and not the Russian Trade Federation. Vladimir Putin said at the time to Ukraine, if you open up a trade agreement with Europe and a free trade agreement with us, it's going to mean cheap European products are going to flood into Russia and damage our economy. We can't allow that.
So Russia had a very kind of surface level free trade agreement with Ukraine before the EU deal happened. They had also the trade federation he's talking about around the time that they were going to sign the EU deal that Ukraine did not end up signing. The deal with this is that, yes, Zlochevsky Yanukovych was ousted because of the trade deal mostly. It was because he denied the EU trade deal. People in Ukraine wanted more connection with the EU to trade within their markets, and he was ousted. And then his successor signed signed the deal to essentially open up EU markets. And they did not sign the Russia Federation deal, like Tim Pool is implying. They did have free trade with Russia. Now, Tim Pool's argument becomes Russia had to invade Crimea because Ukraine was funneling EU goods through their borders to trade them cheaply with Russia. Is that true? Possibly, if Russia has horrible customs enforcement. I mean, most countries have some kind of transshipment laws that prevent that kind of fraud. The U.S. certainly does. You can't, if we have tariffs on China, China can't send its goods to like Madagascar and then ship it to us, pretending that Madagascar was the one producing them. Customs would easily sniff that out and put the tariff on those goods. So this is a BS talking point again. It might have been Russia propaganda at the moment. I don't know. It might have actually been propaganda. But yeah, that's essentially what happened. And Putin did not invade Crimea because he was worried about EU goods coming in. I feel like that's not even close to his real incentives. His real incentives were, number one, his military base, the Black Sea Fleet. He was basically, I can stipulate that he was kind of concerned about Ukraine withdrawing the treaty that they've given him to have control over the Black Sea Fleet. But for the most part, he was mad that Ukraine was becoming more aligned with the West. It was more of a nationalist ideology thing than a economic thing or military thing, in my opinion.
What ends up happening? The Euromaidan movement ousts Viktor Yanukovych, stripping all Russian interests, Russian-aligned interests from the country, and puts in power an administration that was more pro-West. And Vladimir Putin says, I'm not going to lose this soft power battle, even if I have to invade. The first thing they did was dispatch their troops from Sevastopol to claim Crimea got a referendum. And they had their referendum, which I think is largely fake bullshit. They just walked outside and said, hey, look, everybody's Russian now. Crimea, however, had in the past voted for independence and were blocked illegally, I would argue, by the Ukrainian government in the 90s. This ends up with a separate...
That's not true. Just a casual lie, as Tim Pool does. The 1991 referendum on Crimea was not for independence from Ukraine. It was for autonomy. And they did vote to be autonomous. Now, a few years later, the leader of Crimea tried to effectively secede from Ukraine. And through pressure from Ukraine, they ended up backing down. But the people never voted for that. Over 50% of Crimeans said, we want to be independent from Russia and essentially part of the Ukrainian SSR administrative state that was being transferred to what is now known as Ukraine. And they said we wanted to be a part of that, and they did vote to be autonomous, but they never voted to secede. I don't know what the vote would be if they wanted to secede. They would probably be a minority that wanted to secede, because then they'd have to deal with essentially like trade issues with Ukraine. It's much easier for them to be a part of Ukraine in reality. But no, they never voted to become independent from Ukraine. They voted to become independent from Russia and autonomous within Ukraine.
Movement emerging in the East. Outrage the president, who was duly elected, was removed in what people who are pro-Russia would call a coup, but at the time they were saying an illicit removal of the president of Ukraine. Russia began supplying weapons and training to the Eastern separatist movements, which largely did not expand in any meaningful way. However, after Donald Trump lost in 2020 and Joe Biden came in, Western interests were reignited in Ukraine, and this pause was largely due to the fact that Donald Trump was uninterested in this direct involvement in Ukraine, much the way the Democratic administrations had been under Obama and with Hillary Clinton at the State Department. Once Joe Biden got in and started to re-up U.S. interests in the region, largely over getting cheap energy into Europe, Russia then decided...
How so? What U.S. interests is he talking about? I don't understand. Like, Trump opposed Nord Stream, Biden opposed Nord Stream. How is he ignoring that? That's a similarity. They both were acting in the interest of the EU and their oil independency and lack of oil dependency from Russia, at least as a stated goal. They both did so with the Nord Stream pipelines. How did Joe Biden, within Ukraine again, after his insiders, according to Tim Pool, left Burisma in 2019, how did he accomplish any of that? This is complete nonsense.
To do a hard invasion. I think they were wrong to do it. I think they had lost the soft power battle. I think soft power is an appropriate means of force in winning conflict. But I admit that soft power can often lead to hard conflict, but I'm not so stupid and naive to think that wars don't happen. Russia crossed the line militaristically. However, the U.S. then immediately intervened and started supplying, NATO in the West, started supplying Ukraine with weapons, which kind of shocked the Russians who thought they were going to win this relatively quickly, though they never said 3 days. That was actually, I think, someone on the BBC who said that.
That is true. Putin was expecting a weak Western response, and luckily that did not happen.
Russia has been now flooding the zone, and they've seized the entirety of the eastern region, for which their principal purpose in starting this war is not about seizing Ukraine. It is about controlling Sevastopol, where they have a $300 million or multi-billion-dollar military naval infrastructure, the home of the...
When was Sevastopol ever threatened? Ukraine gave Russia, they signed it over to Russia. You can have Sevastopol and essentially not sovereignty over it, but control over it, and operate your Black Sea Fleet out of Sevastopol. That treaty was extended it was extended far beyond 2022. I think in 2040s or 2050s. Absolutely not true. And why do you need to invade into the Donbass to claim Sevastopol? That makes no sense.
Black Sea Fleet, which is their access to the Mediterranean through the Bosphorus, and then ultimately into the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden and the Arabian Sea, where what the United States derisively calls Russia a cold gas station. Russia needs access to the Black Sea to be able to sell oil and natural gas and other resources along the Mediterranean. And if they get cut off from the Black Sea, it's going to be massively damaging to their economy. That's why they seized Crimea. Now, the important thing to understand is they didn't invade Crimea. They were already there in Sevastopol, where they have a naval base. They simply released the troops from this area to have a referendum. But
is that the important thing to understand? I mean, yes, they had a naval base there, and they abused Sevastopol, which they did not have sovereignty over, and Ukraine kindly handed them control of, in order to seize Crimea quite quickly and with a relatively quiet response from the West. I mean, that's just what happened. And the idea that he's defending Russian actions through the lens of oil and then critiquing Western actions through the lens of oil. That's the main problem with his argument, is that Russia is doing these insane actions in order to essentially claim a non-existent reward of having essentially more control over EU's oil market. Like, come on. Putin doesn't care about that. Do you think Putin cares that much about his people's standard of living? Because that's essentially what Tim Pool is making it sound like. He's making it sound like, oh, my poor people are going to have to sell oil at a slightly lower cost, at a slightly lower price. They're going to make less revenue and revenue and profit. He doesn't care about them. Putin's the richest man in the world, probably. He doesn't care.
Invasion of the eastern regions, which is Donetsk, Luhansk, Mariupol, Zaporizhia, etc. This is about securing a land bridge access to Crimea so they don't get cut off from their naval base. Now, some people have argued, yeah, but they could build a naval base anywhere else they have access in, what do they have? Hold on. Sochi, I think, is the name of the city. They have access to, Sochi. They could build a base there. Russia's not going to give up a military base to the west, to the EU. That's not going to happen. So they're going to do what they have to do to secure this region of the country. Now, we can look at a few other instances where I would argue that our involvement in Ukraine has been bad for us. That was Germany accused a Ukrainian national of bombing Nord Stream 2, and Ukraine is accused of engaging in actions like this to create public support for U.S. and Western involvement in this country. So, all in all, the U.S. should not be meddling in the foreign affairs of the Middle East and Eastern European nations for the purpose of securing cheaper gas and energy for NATO. The tangential reason,
for the EU, NATO is not a centralized thing. And no, the US did not secure cheaper oil. They didn't even come close. That was never even in the Overton window of the goals of our operations in Ukraine. It's a complete BS. Like, the idea that through Hunter Biden and the former CIA personnel, that this whole operation was flowing through them is insanity. It's literal insanity. I don't even know where to start with Tim Pool. All right, I think I'll end it there. I mean, I think he's just going to talk to this pro-Ukrainian girl who probably doesn't know enough to argue with him.